there's another set of use cases where it's not so great, and that's okay. We're working, for instance, on new work to make things work better on mobile phones or other limited computing platforms. One of the things that I thought it was interesting that's being asked for in several of the presentations is functionality for easy site registration. We both heard that from LinkedIn and others talking about using the Facebook Connect style information to do that. And I also saw, for instance, in the LinkedIn presentation, work to do these JavaScript-based. You just put a few lines of code in your page and things work. And that's one of the areas that the OpenID Foundation is pursuing as well from a plumbing perspective. So this work is occurring in what we call the artifact binding working group, which, that's almost certainly not the final branding for whatever it gets called. It's a very geeky, plummy kind of name for the new feature that's being added that makes it work on mobile phones with limited browsers and things like that. It incorporates work from the OpenID Connect working group as well, where, again, I loved coming at the end of many of these things because I've heard people saying, well, we'd love to have a Facebook Connect-like thing, but where all the links don't point into Facebook, where it's an open system. Well, we're working on that. As a process point, the OpenID Foundation is, unsurprisingly, both about open technologies and doing things in an open way. So all of this is happening in an open participatory process, where if you think you have engineering or user interface ideas to bring to the table, we encourage you to come to the party and play with us. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the participants, but we had an impromptu working group meeting at RSA, and I thought it was illustrative both to show the company diversity of those working on the specs, as well as the geographic diversity. I happened to go out to dinner with some of my spec co-authors, and there was somebody from Chile, somebody from Japan, somebody from the Netherlands, and I was the token American, and all that's great. About the plumbing, we're building a lot of the new work on the OAuth 2.0 specs, again, that have come up, and that I have more than a passing personal involvement in, although that's not why we're doing it. We're doing a lot of work using JSON, for those of you who know what that is. In some sense, there's a rough consensus that JSON is becoming the new XML, the new sort of common way to represent data in open web apps. And there's a token format based on JSON that I'm the author of. The goal is something we heard before, easy implementation on all modern web platforms. And I should add, making it easy to build user interfaces that people can use. Reducing the clicks and just having it work is absolutely critical. So, if you want to hear more about the specs, come talk to me. I don't want to take up too much more of our time because we're running behind. The specs are still in a fluid state, but they're getting firmer. There should be sort of full drafts of everything by IIW in May. There are implementations going on of various parts of the specs by multiple parties, which is heartening to see that the hacker community and people with business needs to meet are showing up and just starting to build code based on preliminary specs. Again, I'm not going to burden you with the details. We're trying to meet needs of things that we think that the current specs are not meeting, and they're based on actual business cases, not just, we thought we could do this and it would be cool. One of the interesting things, and Eric brought this up in his presentation, is, while OpenID today, the plumbing for an identifier is a URL. Most people have no idea what their URL is, if they even have one. Or most people know that they have an email address. One of the interesting open questions is, do we provide a identifier format, which is a phone number, to the extent that, you know, this is your computing device or something more modern than this? There may be an argument for that. I'll make a plug for the relationship between the OpenID summits and the technical work. We're very intentionally using many of the summits as vehicles for convening those doing the technical work and the user interface work, so that we both have ways of driving process into specs, but we're also being informed by people out in the trenches trying to build things that work and meet business needs. I mean, you'll notice that the question I asked Mike from LinkedIn wasn't about plumbing. It was, what business value are you providing your site, and what business value you're providing those using your service. We'll post these up on the Summit site so you can get to it. There are a number of links to resources. I post about most of this on my blog, which is the shortest URL if you want to write one down. And you can contact me that way, or send me a note at Microsoft. My email address is very, very public. It's been on the web since about '92, and it's in every search engine in every category on the planet. Any questions before I turn it over to the people I really want to hear from?
Great. Steve? Sure. Thank you, Mike.
Sure.
Can you copy? Sorry, do you want me to use your laptop? I can, if that one's all set, I can use that one. Do you have a copy of it? No, it should be there. All right. Just use any one of them here. Okay. Okay, I'll reintroduce myself. I was brief in the early introductions. I'm a senior IT architect at Kodak. I have kind of a unique job in that I have a lot of experience with IT and dealing with internal systems, requirements on reliability and security, and that skill set is something that our business units can leverage. They don't necessarily recognize that. So I have the position of, they want some of the capabilities that we have, but they hate IT because IT always slows down the business units. So it's a bit of a challenge. But a couple of years ago, I was approached and asked, what kind of technology is available to provide a universal identity for consumers, and that led me to do a little bit of research and ultimately connect with JAMRing. And so that's kind of the beginning of the story, and we'll step through a little bit. So our objectives at Kodak are to enable what we have branded kind of a one Kodak experience. That's our marketing strategy, and we want that for consumers and customers. Essentially, that means a single identity that they can take to any of a number of Kodak properties. And these properties are Kodak developed and hosted, or they could be licensed through an application service provider, or could be software as a service. That makes the problem really complicated, in that we don't have direct control. Only for those sites that we've developed, and even those sites tend to be legacy. We try not to invest too much in them. There may be a limited knowledge of the code base behind because the person who built it retired.
George.
So deployment. Kodak, we're targeting and these are rough numbers in terms of giving you a scale, a couple 100,000 customers, maybe 60 million consumers. The difference between consumers and customers, the consumers choose their identity. They may prefer their Yahoo or their Google identity. We want them to make that choice. And they self-provision their account. So if they choose to use a trusted third-party identity when they register to establish their account with Kodak, they'll use that identity. In the case of customers, slightly different here. Here's where I'm going to deviate a little bit from Sears. Reality is we're following Sears about 2 years late. Very, very, very similar, but we have a deviation in the kind of customer space. In the case of a customer, the customer is going to use a Kodak identity. It's going to be an OpenID identity, and consider the Kodak OpenID identity as I'll call it a private commercial identity. We just heard in a previous talk the notion of maybe I need a commercial identity. I would differentiate an identity from, hello? An identity from PayPal as I'm just going to speak loudly. An identity from PayPal as a public commercial identity, and an identity from Kodak as a private commercial identity. We only let our customers, not any customer, use the Kodak OpenID identity. Results, too early yet. We're early at this. Lessons learned. This is kind of a quick summary on the first slide. The B2C experience, the consumer experience, and the B2B, the customer experience, they're separate. They diverge quite a bit. And you can be a consumer and a customer, but you have pretty different personas there. I bet all of you are both. You have a personal identity on the internet for your social experience, and you have a business identity with a business email address, as an example. Authentication is a critical service. It's required to have the highest levels of availability. We're learning this painfully. As soon as you can't authenticate at a site, especially as in our case, our intent is you have one identity as a consumer, one identity as a customer, and we want you to be able to go to any of our sites. If you can't log in once, it has an impact everywhere, and I hear about it immediately, any hour of the day, and I get to go and talk to the CIO when that happens. So it's absolutely critical that that be always available. Security, it's a moving target and requires continuous investment. I'm a security analyst as well, and security is something we got to spend a lot of time on with OpenID.
Why? Can I ask why?
Why do we have to spend time on it, or why is it important?
What's the security you have to spend specifically security on OpenID? Is there a big difference between OpenID versus securing your website or doing other things? Is there inherent security issues with OpenID, what you're saying?
No, there are not any greater. In fact, there are less, and that's why I went to OpenID. But it's new, and it gets a lot of attention. And so everybody's worried about security. There's also the issue of, if I authenticate directly with Kodak, and I trust Kodak to manage my credentials, that's one thing. Even if my mechanism is weak, I got a legacy site, it doesn't even use SSL. Well, I have control over that, and I'm directly accountable and responsible if something happens. But if I trust and delegate or allow a different identity provider to authenticate my user, even if they are really solid, they may be big and invest a lot of money. They might be Microsoft or Google or Yahoo. They're also real targets as well, because that's where everybody goes. And hardly anybody goes to Kodak to authenticate. So that's part of the issue. Okay, Kodak. The target user groups. I mentioned customers and consumers. It's important to kind of identify your target audience and define them. The consumer, that's you and me when we go as an individual to make a purchase, for example, on a website. As a customer, you have a relationship with Kodak at a business level. You may be a commercial printing house that purchased one of our commercial printers. You may be a retailer like CVS that has our kiosks. Business partner. So these get into smaller communities, but they're also relevant. These would be people we partner with to develop product and that are outside our company, don't have a Kodak credential, but we rely on them. And we're doing more and more partnering. So that's a growing, dynamic community. I want to touch them. Retirees, people that have been employed by Kodak, have a relationship with Kodak, but are no longer with Kodak, don't have a Kodak identity, but they have a reason to come back to Kodak. Call center representatives. We touched on this a little bit with other talks. For Kodak, they're a real important audience. They're dynamic. They change all the time. They're low skilled. There's 1,000 of them. And we can't really afford to provision them a Kodak credential and a secure ID token and have them connect to the Kodak internal network. It's just a nightmare, logistics and expense. So I want to target them for OpenID as well. So in essence, the audience for OpenID is everybody that doesn't have a Kodak identity, that we don't do the heavy lifting of provisioning a Kodak identity for them. We want the lighter weight OpenID approach. Okay, I'm giving you a little bit of a screen of a potential consumer experience. This is just a mock-up. We haven't deployed this. We've shelved it for a little bit. But the identity is to improve on maybe what we start with on our Exchange site, which is our social networking site at Kodak. Doesn't get a lot of publicity. It's not a huge volume of users. We're migrating towards a richer sign-in workflow that is logging in, registering, doing password resets, a lot of complexity. And we've sort of created a first draft of what that might be. This is just a sense of what the first screen might look like. Where on the left-hand side, if you want to establish a Kodak identity and let us manage your credentials, that's the left side. The right side is the white list of identity providers we would trust. As a kind of an aside, the one that's missing, referencing an earlier talk, is AOL. It turns out when we do statistics on email addresses for all of the Kodak users, we have a large population of AOL users. So we do have an older demographic. And just like Sears, we want to change that a bit, but we also want to recognize that demographic. The button's not there because they don't work as cleanly today. So this is a pitch to get them to move a little quicker. They don't work as cleanly with the rest in terms of the flow through Janrain as an aggregator. Janrain's our partner in building this out. Here's a sign-in that dramatically different, the first page for our B2B experience. The big difference here, it's just Kodak. You're putting in your credentials. You're creating an identity with Kodak. And you're requesting an account. So you have to go through an account provisioning flow that isn't the self-provisioning. You have to work through a Kodak or a business contact within Kodak in order to get an account because there's a lot of configuration that's required. So this is a quick rundown. I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, but what were my requirements for our OpenID, Kodak OpenID authentication service? I basically wanted to allow all my relying party or my websites to consume identities from an external or a Kodak identity provider. So I needed the consumer, I need the provider, and I also want a data store that allows all that data to flow into one place that's central to Kodak that we can leverage in order to support our CRM initiatives and the like. So this sounds a whole lot like Janrain, Engage, Federate, and Capture, because it is. Not every site supports OpenID authentication. We need something called, which I've not coined, but through reading have identified as a federation, identity federation gateway. I need to be able to authenticate my users with OpenID, but possibly deliver to the website a SAML assertion Or in addition, I need to authenticate with OpenID, but reach into an Active Directory in order to pull out the user's credentials. So I need a little bit of a mix there because I got a ton of legacy. I don't control my software as a service provider, out of the box experience. I don't control the ASP solutions. So I need to somehow still satisfy my requirement for OpenID, but accommodate the legacy and the reality of what you're purchasing. Okay, so the use cases are a couple here. On premise, we have a fairly large build out of a business objects environment for reporting. And we've got an example here of CRM through Oracle On Demand. In both cases, one uses Active Directory, the other uses SAML in terms of authentication. So in the B2B space, a real quick run through on this, we need to be able to stitch together a large number of sites and provide a user the ability to come to a landing page to sign in and then expose through tabs what sites they have been configured to be able to access. So the iPortal integration framework, our portal is our branding for our B2B world, is I need to have loose integration with a navigation bar at the top. I need OpenID to authenticate the user. And then I need to be able to provide web services to replicate data to the legacy websites. So each website has its own registration database, its own profile for controlling permissions for the user. So the iPortal is to enable that. And let's just slide by that quickly.
This meeting is now over. Thank you for calling.
So this is...
No pressure, Steve.
Okay, no pressure. Real quickly here, because I'm in IT, I had to put up one of these. But what I wanted to point out is, on the left-hand side, right now Technologies is a software as a service that is the case management software our call center agents use. They are going to support, very soon, if not already published, OpenID authentication natively at their website. They're not going to support OpenID authentication for their rich smart client, which is installed on your desktop, not as a web application, but as a rich desktop application. They're going to support SAML authentication. So there's a little bit of a challenge there. We beat them up on that. But the reality is, one of the topics is I need, what we'll call it the smartphone experience of OpenID. Well, that's like a rich desktop application. We need something that's more than just a browser experience for authentication. So just wanted to point that out. So we're going to look at this federation gateway function to enable the smart client. Oracle On Demand supports SAML right now. In the back end, I'm showing we have Active Directory and JanRain Capture, former name UCX. It's easier to type there, so I got it there. Also on the back-hand side, I want you to see user provisioning. We have to build out an application that is for provisioning accounts for business users. It's going to be a very complex, rich application that is for an administrator, but also has to, once an OpenID has been created, has to provision the appropriate accounts at each of the relying party sites because they don't natively support the delegation to an external registry for their credentials. They have to have it locally. So that gives us a vision of or a picture of some of the challenges we have in the B2B space. A little different than the consumer. I think that, okay. So for the technology, I wanted to just call out a few of the notes I made from the excellent presentations earlier. Always you need to reduce the friction for authentication, but that's in conflict with the need for adding more and more security. And so how do we make that balance? How do you have security and reduce the number of clicks and steps that the user has to go through? One of the things that really intrigued me from PayPal is this notion of authentication context. I would really love to know if the identity provider that I've delegated authentication to has actually used two factors to authenticate that user. If that information came back, that would be very powerful to me. That would basically, or if I could say in some sort of the protocol handshake, you know, I'm going to trust that authentication, and if it has this certain context, and if not, I'm going to do something else. So security there in the protocol would be great. So I'm all for the earlier presentation on the authentication context. And there's lots more that I've got here as notes, but I'm gonna cut it short because I know there are more presenters. So any questions?